Adolf Hitler once privately confessed, quote, "Once I've settled my other problem, I'll have my reckoning with the church. I'll have it reeling on the ropes," close quote. Vladimir Lenin wrote, quote, "We must combat religion. That is the ABC of all materialism and consequently of Marxism," close quote. And Mao Zedong insisted, quote, "Religion is poison," close quote. What happens when secularist ideologies who hate religion achieve totalitarian power? Professor Thomas Albert Howard joins us to discuss his entrancing yet troubling book, Broken Altars: Secularist Violence in Modern History Now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Thomas Albert Howard, also known as Tal, received his BA from the University of Alabama and his PhD from the University of Virginia. He is a professor of humanities and history and a holder of the Phyllis and Richard Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics at Valparaiso University, where he's affiliated with Christ College, Valparaiso's humanities-based honors college. He also serves as a senior fellow for the Lilly Network of church-related colleges and universities. He is the author or editor of many books, including Broken Altars: Secularist Violence in Modern History, The Faiths of Others: A History of Interreligious Dialogue, and The Pope and the Professor: Pius IX, Ignaz von Dollinger, and the Quandary of the Modern Age, among others. His writings have appeared in peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of the History of Ideas, History of Universities, Journal of Church and State, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and in more general venues such as Hedgehog Review, Wall Street Journal, Modern Age, Touchstone, Inside Higher Ed, National Interest, Christian Century, Law and Liberty, First Things, University Bookman, Books and Culture, and Commonweal. Tal's work has been translated into Russian, German, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. Currently, he has 2 books forthcoming: Modern Christian Theology and Intellectual History, and Travel as a Liberal Art: Place, Faith, History. Tal Howard, welcome.
It's a delight to be here with you. Thanks for having me on.
Segment 1. Is secularism harmless? In his book, Broken Altars: Secularist Violence in Modern History, Tal Howard writes, quote, "For many educated Westerners, the idea that religion promotes violence and secularism ameliorates the problem is a settled certainty, a doxa, an unstated premise of right thinking." He would go on to write, "In terms of sheer numbers, the misery, deaths, and destruction visited on religious communities by secularist regimes in the 20th century vastly exceed the violence committed during early modern European wars of religion, which are routinely invoked to legitimate the necessity of the modern secular nation state." So, Tal, let's begin with the obvious question. Where did the misconception originate that religion and not secularism has been most culpable for violence perpetuated in the 20th century?
One could probably look at several places, but I think that that type of narrative, began with 18th century philosophers and what's called the Enlightenment, and they certainly had some reason for that. The period prior to that, there were wars in Europe that pitted Protestants against Catholics. But as I argue in the book, this became sort of a dominant narrative to explain all of modern history. And if you take a more expansive view, looking into the 19th and 20th century, I really don't think that narrative holds water. But it's sort of a popular myth of the more secular intelligentsia, I would say. But it has a certain myopic character when you think of a history in more global terms.
This is the premise of your book, Broken Altars, and it is a tour de force of example after example, regime after regime of secularism that runs afoul of religion. So again, I really would recommend people read this. Let's say this, that many consider secularism in a way to be neutral, to be rational, to be just non-religious. It's kind of a soothing, impartial hand that stays the white-hot passions of religion. Though people think of this secularism this way, is that a fair definition, and why or why not?
Well, it really depends on how you define secularism. I mean, the book mainly focuses on political forms of secularism that have arisen in modern history. And in terms of neutrality, I think the American First Amendment would be an example of that. What I call in the book passive secularism.
Mhm.
But I'm keen to argue that you shouldn't mistake that for all modern secularism. There are different versions. It might be better to think of secularism in the plural. But the ones that I document as being especially violent prone are what I call combative secularism and eliminationist secularism.
And we're going to dive deeply into all three of those definitions, which are incredibly helpful. And you begin the book just with those defining terms. Let's talk a little bit about some of the philosophical godfathers of secularism. Who are they that you could describe, and what kind of impelled them to such a mindset?
Yeah. Well, if I could profile the three different forms of secularism,
Sure.
in terms of one that I subscribe to, the passive secularism, and you would see that in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I think at the time of the Second Vatican Council, Dignitas Humanae endorses that type of that religion should never be coerced by the state. Here, there are many religious figures, minorities, such as William Penn and Roger Williams, or just to focus on the United States, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson would be proponents of this view. But combative secularism, which I see as more problematic, that arose with figures in the Enlightenment like Voltaire or Diderot, important French philosophers. It really comes to sort of political manifestation in the radical phases of the French Revolution in the 1790s, and that's there was quite a bit of anti-clericalism, desecration of churches, selling off of churches, even a war against the devout Catholics who were trying to combat the revolution in the Vendée region of Western France. So there are a number of other figures that would be proponents of this type of again what I call combative secularism. The really worrisome one, though, is eliminationist secularism, and that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels helped shape that. Marx famously called religion opiate of the masses, though he actually wrote quite little on religion per se. But as that kind of got caught up in 19th century political radicalism, anarchism, different movements, that really began to snowball. And a figure like Vladimir Lenin in the late 19th century and the early 20th century really sort of sharpened the spear, if you will, against religious communities. Especially from his standpoint, he saw the Orthodox Church as just a hulking obstacle to progress, and it was so entwined with Tsarism in Russia that it needed to be essentially eliminated. And there are other minor figures as well, but that will give you something about just the intellectual genealogy of these different forms of secularism.
And again, so much of the premise of this book is these three definitions of passive secularism, combative secularism, eliminationist secularism, which we will kind of delve even further into. Just before we leave the question of philosophical godfathers, clearly a Madisonian kind of view of secularism versus a Marxist-Leninist view of secularism, they can seem to be worlds apart. Can you say there's a common thread that crosses over all three of these categories, or are they just too hard lined and distinctive that you can't even find that?
Yeah. I think there is, a somewhat of a through line, and the desire to separate in some level religion and the political sphere or the secular sphere. But we could talk about this binary dichotomy as well between the religious and the seculars. In some ways, that's kind of a uniquely Western thing, and is through just the power of Western ideas and colonialism and globalization, many other cultures have adopted that. But actually, in a number of countries, even the word religion, they didn't have an abstraction for that, or the word secularism. These are kind of, so I think that idea, and you could say this has really deep roots, even in Christian history, the realm of Caesars and the realm that's not Caesars in some ways. So you can give it a positive read in that. I do think there's some overlap between the combative and eliminationist secularism. There is a real hostility to faith in both of them. A desire to see the state as sort of the more robustly defining the common good. In the book, I argue that the combative secularism tends to tilt in more anti-clerical direction than fully anti-religious. So it's more worried about churches, church wealth, hierarchy, and those types of things. But eliminationist secularism, especially because it has this Marxist element that sees religion as an opium of the people, an opium of the masses, that it sort of has a more of a philosophical view that ultimately religion will peter out in human history. It's destined, as the proletariat revolution comes, as ideas of equality are spread through the revolution. The general idea, Marxist idea, was religion's time, just a matter of time before it's not a small step. When you have more radical revolutionaries like Lenin arise the idea, since this is kind of on borrowed time in the modern world anyway, why don't we just hasten it off the historical stage? And that's where you get the more robust anti-religious policies you see in the Soviet Union, really shortly after the revolution, but were really ratcheted up in the time of Stalin in the late 1920s, 1930s.
As you read this book, you really realize the lengths with which regimes have gone, or political systems have gone, to try to eradicate, and every last vestige of religion. The notion of God going against, or faith going against the political system. The political system has worked very, very hard to eradicate every last bit of it. So there hasn't been a lack of an effort to destroy religion on the face of the earth, that, as you've cataloged so very well. I want to ask you, Tal, certain political isms have fallen under the umbrella of secularism, including nationalism, fascism, socialism, communism, and thinkers such as Raymond Aron and Nicholas Berdyaev and Eric Vogelin and Emilio Gentile have described such secularisms as political or secular religions, which, as you have written, engage in the dual process of, quote, the sacralization of the political on the one hand, and the politicization of elements of the inherited religious culture on the other, close quote. So I found this very interesting, because you raised a point that I'd never thought about the notion of defining some of these as secular religions. Is describing National Socialism, Soviet Communism, Italian fascism, and other such isms as secular religions, is it a fair description, and why or why not?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Two things I have to say on that. First, I do focus some on nationalism, but I really didn't treat the Nazi example or the fascist example. Certainly in Spain and in Italy, there is more of a kind of a blurring of the boundaries between the political and the religious there. But as the quote you began with, Adolf Hitler, although he did not deem it pragmatic to take on the church's front on, there was it was a secular ideology as well. In some ways, if I included nationalism more fully as a form of secularism, the argument almost becomes too easy at that point. So I focus a little more on sort of the leftist ideologies that had these more stadial views of progress or human history, that history moves in stages from the religious roughly to the irreligious or the secular. And some of the figures that you mentioned, I draw a lot on the scholarship, and there's some good scholarship of folks who want to define modern political ideologies as religion. The problem I have with that, though, is that part of a historian's toolkit is you should try to understand historical actors as they understood themselves, right? And the last thing Vladimir Lenin thought he was doing was establishing another religion. He
Yeah.
really saw himself as exercising religion from human consciousness.
Yeah.
And, for that reason, and for those who say that really it's just fanaticism and religion that drives violence, you get off the hook a little too easily if you just say, well, yeah, Marxism, religion, it's another religion. Of course, religions are all violent, so this is just
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
secular religion. So I do kind of grant some autonomy to the secular sphere and take at face value those voices who kind of wanted to abolish religion, or as I said earlier, hasten it off the historical stage, since that seemed to be the so-called inevitable course of history.
I love the fact that you in kind of having some criticism of the categorization of these as secular religions. Part of was what you just said, which is it's somewhat insulting to authentic religion. Because like you said, they get lumped. It's like, well, there's Christianity and then
Yeah,
there's communism, and it's like, oh, they're all, and they, like you said, they're all violent. It's like, well,
yeah,
wait a second here. So
yeah,
and that notion of historical actors understanding them or as seeing themselves as they saw themselves, so to speak. That's also
yeah.
very insightful as well.
That's right. Yeah,
The exalted values assigned to secularism, so values such as progress, science, historical inevitability, freedom, equality, all these vaunted values, they're often juxtaposed against religion in an effort to counter religion. So social theorist Jose Casanova, whom you cite, notes that among educated elites, secularization is, quote, a universal teleological process of global human development from belief to unbelief, from primitive irrational or metaphysical religion to modern rational, post metaphysical, secular consciousness, close quote. So, in other words, it seems that going from religion to secularism means going from darkness to light, from mythology to reality, from superstition to science. Has secularism, and I'm reading this, and again, this is what I've encountered in my reading of the various isms that you've described over many years. Has secularism kind of dripped with such haughtiness from its very beginning?
yeah, a little bit. I mean, what Casanova is talking about, and what I talk about in the book is sort of a progressive view of history that has different starting points. You see it in the Enlightenment. You see, especially in a philosopher like Hegel,
Hmm.
in the 19th century, that sees history moving in certain stages. You see it in a French figure, the founding father of the discipline of sociology, Auguste Comte. He had this threefold stage of history that moved from the theological to the philosophical to the positivist, or purely scientific. And I guess you could say there's a little haughtiness in believing that the course of history.
Right.
Marx always said that he wasn't just giving a theory. He really thought that he had developed a scientific theory of how history works. He's, the German term Wissenschaft. The idea was your absolute certainty in the course of Marx. And I mean, of course, he has a similar narrative that moves from the feudal and the reactionary to the bourgeois to the proletariat. I think there is something a little arrogant in believing that you can pontificate on the course of history. As a historian, part of my job is to recognize complexity in history, and that
Yeah.
unpredictable things happen, and it's really hard to predict history, and there should be a sort of an associative humility with that as you think about historical facts and narratives that we have.
Well, and kind of back to that notion of humility versus hubris, if you will. It does seem that every time you have, as you describe, these stadial philosophies or philosophies that are rooted in this one stage succeeding the other, it always seems that mankind kind of gets in there and says, "Well, these are the stages that are going to happen. They're all inevitable, but we're impatient, so we're going to make it happen faster. And
Yeah.
if we have to kill 10 million of 100 million people to make it happen, so be it. Long live the revolution." Did you find, from a philosophical, thinker and so on, do you find it interesting that in the midst of this supposed inevitability, this succession of one stage or the other, that we do find figures in history that want to move this ball forward at whatever cost is necessary? Is that surprising to you, or would you say that's just the human appetite for power and the millennia and so on? What's your sense about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think in the the historical terrain that I cover, you would certainly find, ideologues who would really believe in a kind of hyper secularism. But I think all along there's just questions of realpolitik, and that sometimes just borrowing this scientific ideology gives one legitimation to pursue certain policies that might have the effect of aggrandizing the power of the state. And there are often debates. So, just to stick with the Soviet example, there are many voices that were against figures like Lenin and saying, no, you shouldn't focus on religion. According to Orthodox Marxism, religion is just going to peter out as industrialization and the proletariat revolution goes forth. And so there were critics of the direction that some of the more radical revolutionaries wanted to take. But I think in the Soviet Union and some of the other countries that I profile, that they recognized that religion had a stronger hold on the people than they thought it did. And if you're trying to sort of define the political sphere as the be all and end all of the common good and the moral locus of community formation and idea and ideal formation, there was a recognition of the of the sort of the power of faith, for many people, and sometimes people were very attracted to the political ideals of equality or redistribution of property, but were driven in their arms away from that because of just the harsh treatment of the religious sector.
Yeah, yeah. Tal, secularism it believes in secularism that believes in exclusive humanism. Further defines itself in relation to religion. And as you write in Broken Altars, exclusive humanism believes three primary tenets. One, individual and communal action should rest in the state and not the church. Two, dignity as a child of God is replaced by dignity as a member of a collective class or race. And three, radical, pitiless egalitarianism replaces the natural hierarchies of religion and the human society. Could you say a little bit about how these anti-religious tenets, and we're going to go deeper into the three types of secularism, but can you say a little bit of how these anti-religious tenets impact culture?
Yeah, this term I found helpful, exclusive humanism. It's popularized more recently by the philosopher Charles Taylor in his book The Secular Age, but he actually took it from Henri de Lubac, a very important French Catholic theologian in the 20th century. And as the term implies, it's there's kind of an irreligious element to it. That the human, the here and now, not the transcendent, is sort of the be all and end all.
Yeah.
And therefore it tends to disqualify religious organizations or various forms of non-state community organizations from being sort of in the driver's seat of history or the definer of normative values and what counts as the community. Some of these ideologies have been very invested in egalitarianism, and just for most of human history, societies are often organized hierarchically. For better or worse. I think there's some good things about modern ideals of equality, so I don't want to knock it completely, but I think coming up against those hierarchies and the forms of authority that they had has been something of a main driver of many types of historical processes in the modern period.
Segment 2, the forms and philosophy of secularism. In the 22nd chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees once again strive to entrap Christ. Tell us what is your opinion, they said. Is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not? Knowing their malice, Jesus said, Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin that pays the census tax. Then they handed him the Roman coin. He said to them, Whose image is this and whose inscription? They replied, Caesar's. At that he said to them, Then render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. So Tal, you scooped me by bringing this up in the first portion. But so this is obviously one of the most famous elucidations of church-state relations, and also captured in T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. King Henry II mutters within earshot of his knights, Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? which leads to the assassination of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, with whom the king had been at odds. So let me just start this segment with this question. Why have church and state forever had such tense relations?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and and one could expand the question to other parts of the world as well.
Mm.
Relationship between spiritual, religious, however you want to call it, and the body politic, the state, the government. In Western history, I think you're right. In going back to that famous verse from the gospel, and that it does sort of kind of lay out two different spheres, the realm of Caesar and the realm of not Caesar. I know the philosopher Jacques Maritain has a wonderful little book called "The Things That Are Not," not Caesar's. But if I may paint with very broad strokes in Western history, especially the office of the Pope and the Emperor, in antiquity, but then what later became the Holy Roman Emperor, there was just sort of a long debate about the respective powers between the two, and sometimes unity, often competition. So I think that's one reason in the West, but I think both are laying claim in some ways to a type of authority.
Hmm.
What is a good society? What should the human being be about? What is the nature of law? There again, you have civil law and canon law. So it's a complex, multi-layered reality when we think of the relationship between the two.
So we're going to move into these three forms of secularism, passive secularism, combative secularism, eliminationist secularism. And you began the first segment with just kind of alluding to and some definitions and so on. So let's start with the thought of the 19th century French priest and scholar Félicité de Lamennais, I think that's how I pronounce it, the First Amendment of the American Bill of Rights, and the 1831 Belgian Constitution. What did these three figures or documents contribute to the modern forms of what we call passive secularism? And before you go into what those basically contribute, could you once again, and forgive me, could you once again define what do you mean by passive secularism?
Sure. Yeah. So passive secularism is an attempt to recognize that it might be better for politics and religion to if they weren't too entangled with one another, and it's tries to recognize a legitimate sphere where religious communities can operate, and what is the government or the state. But it's complicated.
Yeah.
Things don't necessarily divide that. I mentioned some of the forefathers of this before. Another person I probably should mention would be John Locke.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as he looked at the some of this religious element in the English Civil Wars, began to theorize sort of different parts. He still was worried about Catholics and atheists,
Yeah.
and his
Yeah.
famous letter on toleration from the late 1680s. But I try to call attention to other examples in Europe, like the Belgian Constitution and Lamennais, because I didn't want readers to think this is just sort of a defense of America.
Yeah. Yeah. Of
Something.
course.
I want to say it has larger and versions of this you could find in Australia or in Britain. Even though there's sort of quasi still an established church there, or even India might be an example of passive secularism. But that being said, I do think the United States and the First Amendment, recognize for principial reasons, but also pragmatic ones. Just because there was so much religious heterogeneity, in the early republic, it was not really possible to have a single national church
Yeah.
of any kind, and that. That has its own history here. I think the in the 20th century, Jacques Maritain, who I talked about, or Lamennais, Félicité de Lamennais, was
Hmm.
a real early prophet of this this type of secularism, but also the Jesuit John Courtney Murray in the 20th century. He was very instrumental in the Dignitas Humanae at the time of the Second Vatican Council. But in a word, I would say it tries to recognize the legitimacy of both realms, and argues that it's better for religion and the state if there's some type of separation. But it also recognizes the value of religion. Like many communist regimes in the 20th century had, technically in their constitution there was freedom of religion, but they often define it much more restrictively as like freedom of worship. So long as you're in the closed doors, behind your, that's okay. But if religion informs your politics or your views on a host of other issues, I would say ideally that would be permitted as well, and not just this more restrictive freedom of worship alone, tucked away in your own community.
Yeah, this, and again, not to cite an example that's just simply American, but you're so much more well versed in the Belgian Constitution. Also, this French priest Lamennais, but specifically, it makes the passive secularism stands out in my mind quite distinct from the combative and the eliminationist, because it seems to be an earnest effort to find that coexistence where each the religious sphere and then the political sphere, if you will, can both in their best efforts inform and optimize the other, so to speak, that there can be this good sphere, this dynamic tension. And it makes me think of the American experiment of every dynamic tension of our federal government, our state versus federal governments, freedoms versus responsibilities, laws that enable and the laws that prohibit, and so on and so forth. It seems that this is just passive secularism strikes me as just trying to find a livable balancing act that where there's a lack of an encroachment. Whereas we move into combative and eliminationist secularism, which seems quite not that case. And so as we talk about combative secularism, it seems to be embodied in Voltaire's vicious line, "Crush the infamous thing," which again, I think, as you've described, it means the church. How did the late phase, so again, definitionally say a word or two about what combative secularism is, and let's talk about how the late phase of the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic dictatorship informed combative secularism, and especially the European Revolution of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871. That was a mouthful of a question. Yeah. So starting with definitions of combative secularism, and then how the early stages of the French Revolution, Napoleon, informed the later manifestations of the Commune and the European revolutions.
Yeah, that's right. Well, in a word, I would say anti-clericalism, mm-hmm. But I would add to that, though, it's much greater hostility to the church. If you read Dante or Erasmus, you'll find anti-clericalism, strong critiques of the clergy, but kind of in the name of a deeper fidelity to Christianity. That's the idea. Certainly, I'm actually discussing Dante with students right now, and he famously puts a number of popes in hell, and really tries to. But the ultimate goal of that type of anti-clericalism is to improve Christianity, to recall Christianity to its deeper principles that sometimes get lost in the machinery of the church apparatus. With figures like Voltaire or Diderot or another one, Condorcet, you have a heightening of the hostility to the church. Again, they should duly recognize some reasons. Often the church in pre-revolutionary France was quite wealthy, privileged, but it was like that quote, "You really want to crush the church." The philosopher Diderot famously said that freedom would not come to Europe until the last priest is hanged by the guts, the entrails of the last king. So I argue in the book that this is not necessarily just hyperbole. But at the time of the French Revolution, especially in its radical stages after 1792, so 1789, early on there was more of a passive secularism. So it probably mirrored a little bit the American Revolution early on, but then it really careened into a sort of all-out hostility toward the church, and this war in the Vendée that I mentioned, and So that's when it becomes more of a political ideology in the Western political bloodstream. As I trace it to countries like Mexico and Spain, but also to non-Western place, or the Ottoman Empire. Drew a lot from this laïcité is the French term of secularism. Napoleon's an interesting character because he recognizes that this type of intense anti-clericalism is not going to be politically tenable. So when he comes to power, there's a famous concordat where he's willing to recognize that Catholicism is the majority religion in France, but he maintained a certain heavy-handed statism that you would find, also in other, not just in France, but in figures like Joseph II in Austria, or Peter the Great in Russia. A nominally Christian but highly statist, desire to bureaucratize the church and kind of bring it under the arm of the state. So he did that within France, but at the same time, the Napoleonic Wars were very hostile to religious communities as they spread throughout Europe, as they spread into Italy, into German-speaking areas, into Spain. Certainly, Napoleon's Russian campaign was, many churches and monasteries were just torched. Many were just looted with the, art and holy objects, brought back to French museums and that type of thing. So in one way, he continues it. He does recognize there needs to be some kind of modus vivendi with the church, but the heavy-handed statism that he kind of was the successor of the enlightened despotism and the French Revolution. He does he's sort of a continuation of that as well. So a ton of monasteries were just completely sacked and wasted in the Napoleonic Wars, and that I think that doesn't have the some scholarly attention to that, but I think there's still a lot of that could be written and researched about that.
Sounds like another book in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, there's one. Jeffrey Beals is his last name, called Prosperity and Plunder. Anyone interested in this? But this looks at just the anti-clerical, especially there's these enlightened despots in the French Revolution. They especially hated the contemplative orders. That these are people who did utterly useless. The inutile was the French word they used over and over again. They had a much more practical approach to society, and so there was a real great hostility to contemplatives. In my view, among the most peaceful human beings.
Yeah, come on, man. Well, and so tell me this, Tal. So let's go back to Auguste Comte, and let's talk about you mentioned him and this kind of, again, I think it was the word stadial, the stages of the religious to the philosophical to the positivist. What was his role in moving the ball forward along the lines of a combative secularism?
Yeah. Well, he was essentially a champion of the French Revolution, but he felt the French Revolution, there was it didn't have a really coherent ideology. It sort of knocked over the old regime, but sort of left society, fragmented. So he really felt a kind of scientistic ideology. Here we maybe get back in the question of, was this a secular religion? Because he does use a lot of quasi-religious language and, trying to think of this status ideology that's post-religious, that still commands the hearts and minds of citizens. That was his goal. And he has the stagist view of history that goes roughly from the theological to the metaphysical or philosophical, and then what he finally called the positivist stage of human history. I think we, especially in the United States, forget how powerful his ideology was in the 19th century and spread everywhere. Even on the Brazilian flag today, there's a quote from him called "Progress and Order," and that's what he wanted to kind of some kind of cohesion that he felt the French Revolution had disrupted. Anyway, to maybe make a long story short here, his ideology was one of the major planks of the French Third Republic in the late late 19th century and early 20th century. It wasn't the only one, but it was very dominant among a number of political figures, often very anti-clerical. And in the late 19th century, there were in France, some replay of the French Revolution. That many there were secularist laws that forbade religious from teaching. The Dominicans and Jesuits were essentially chased out of France in the late 19th century. Other orders, many monasteries and convents were inventoried,
Mm.
and then there was in 1905 there was a really draconian law of the separation of church and state. Since then, I think France has moved in a more moderate direction, but I think there's still significant differences between American religious freedom and French secularism to this day. But at that time, the 1905, that was just a real fracturing of society. It
Mm.
wasn't a peaceable break. Historians speak of the war of the two Frances. France as the eldest daughter of the church was a common name for France in the early modern period, but also France is the daughter of the revolution
Yeah, yeah.
as well. And so that it's not the only one. I think some of the ideology of the French Revolution went into other European countries as well, but it was in some ways one of the more dominant carriers, transmitters of this more radical anti-clerical ideology.
And this was part of the book that just jarred me. And I think part of it was because my conception of the damage that France did to religion was, or its own religious identity, and then it exported it was in the French Revolution and the terror and so on and so forth. To some extent, I sort of had this mindset that maybe things going forward from the French Revolution, it was more of a religious atrophy in the wake of the Napoleonic era, as opposed to an active anti-religiosity that came out. And when you write about this 1905 French law on separation, I mean, it was shocking to me how brutal the government became in shutting down every last aspect of faith. It was I mean, tremendously jarring. And so I think for anybody who isn't familiar with that gap in history, in your, like, I had some of these gaps in history between the French Revolution and then kind of World War I, World War II France. It's shocking. And I want to ask you, um, what's France obviously played a huge role in World War I and World War II, and we obviously saw what happened in both those circumstances. What is your sense about the gutting of the religious identity that France had as recently as 1905, or the actualizing of its gutting, so to speak? What if you, and I know this may not be your historical area of expertise, but what's your sense about what happens to a culture that gets gutted of that religious tension or that religious belief, the two Frances at war with each other, going into a conflict like 1914 to 1918, going into a conflict like World War II? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to start with this War of the Two Frances as well. In the early 19th century, after the Revolution, after Napoleon, there was a real religious renaissance or
Mm-hmm.
upsurge at the time. This is the time of Romanticism. There are figures like René Chateaubriand in his book *The Genius of Christianity*. There were the founding and the recovery of many religious orders. So Catholic France does not go away. You always have to remember too that there's Protestant and Jewish minorities in France
Yeah.
as well, and sometimes they were kind of more on board with the anti-clerical ideology because historically the Catholic Church had more of a presence there. Um, but then there is this real sharpening of complex, in the 19th century. It's harder maybe to generalize more about World War I and World War II.
Sure.
I think there was something of the effect of there are no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, certain religious element that accompanies both of these wars. But I know at the same time, some of the legacy and of that was ever present. ever present as well. I know, a number of religious orders were compelled to be part of the army. Yves Congar, for example,
Mm,
famous Catholic theologian of the 20th century. Um, that just this is maybe a little bit of a digression, but uh, there's this, among some historians the view that by chasing the religious orders out in the late 19th and 20th century, that allowed them to begin to think about a way to kind of reform, restore Catholicism. And who I just mentioned, Yves Congar, he's
hmm
Dominican, and Henri de Lubac, a Jesuit. That they both lived through this period, and ironically, and they both of their religious houses were chased out of France at one time. It kind of gave them the bandwidth maybe to begin developing some of the ideas that really became important for what's called Nouvelle Theologie,
hmm
some of the predecessor thoughts for the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah. Let's move Tal. Let's move into the eliminationist secularism. So let's find out the definition again of what that is, and its distinctiveness from the combative secularism. Then I'll ask you just a little bit about some of its underpinnings with Feuerbach and Marx. So just what is eliminationist secularism, and how do we distinguish it from combative?
Yeah, well, I would say again why combative leans in an anti-clerical direction. uh, Eliminationist secularism is more comprehensively anti-religious. But you might think of a Venn diagram. At some points, I
Mm,
think they overlap with one another in hostility. Another way to come at it would be to say it's taking Marx's notion of the opium of the masses, but kind of radicalizing it, hastening it, as we talked about earlier, and seeing religion and religious communities as a bulwark, an obstacle to exclusive humanist, flourishing, defining
hmm
human flourishing
hmm
in
hmm
non-transcendent, purely immanent political terms.
So let's talk about Feuerbach and Marx. So how did their philosophical mindsets galvanize or kind of give great roots to eliminationist
Yeah,
secularism?
yeah. Yeah, both of them are come in the wake of Friedrich Hegel. So Hegel was a German Prussian philosopher in the late 18th and early 19th century, and a subscriber to a type of stadial vision of history. In very kind of vague, complicated terms. He was still operating within a Christian mindset. But Feuerbach, and also another contemporary, David Friedrich Strauss, who wrote this book on the life of Jesus in 1835, but especially Feuerbach, and I'm simplifying a little bit, but he
Sure.
essentially came up with the idea that there is no God, but what human beings were talking about, they kind of projected onto this non-entity they called God what was really noblest and pure within the human spirit itself.
Hmm.
And so he kind of accompanies this reversal and argues that for type of exclusive humanism, secularist humanism, that it's really human dignity, human ability to think, and that's really what's God. So the human, the human is
Yeah.
God, and Feuerbach's terms, and Marx in one of his theses on Feuerbach, because in German Feuer means fire, and Bach is like a little brook.
Hmm.
He would say that Marx said, we all drink from the fiery brook.
Hmm. Hmm.
Feuerbach. And so Marx kind of takes this idea and runs with it. But then Marx really focuses, away from philosophy toward, socioeconomic matters and agitating for historical change. And, in one of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, he has a famous line that the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was actually that in the University of Berlin and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, that was put that was put on the wall is still there today. You can actually kind of go in and say that so the purpose of the university is to basically create political radicals. Not to, you would think the universities of Plato's view, go all the way back to antiquity, was the university should be the one place that's non-political, that tries to interpret the world. That was the whole point of the university. But I think in East Germany and even today in the United States, there are many people who want to change the world instead of understand.
Exactly.
Instead of understand the world. So that's some of its deeper element. In the late 19th century too, you have many exiles from Russia, like Lenin, like Bakunin, and a number of others, and they really developed more what I think I call in the book at one point a demolitionist view of history. They felt Russia was just so behind, it was so retarded in terms of not being influenced by the Enlightenment and the democratic revolutions and the industrial revolution, that you just had to kind of start from square one. You had to annihilate Tsarism, get rid of the Orthodox Church, and then you could kind of rebuild society, in this carte blanche, new world. So that's all to say that Marx is a contributing factor to this. But again, Marx himself didn't write a lot on religion; really wasn't that interested in it. But later 19th century radicals, it becomes a key piece of their ideology, and they do see fit to radicalize it. And again, not we've talked more about sort of the Christian world, but I didn't want this book too to be like special Christian pleading.
Sure.
That's why I wanted to look at other examples, like combative secularism and modern Turkey. The Soviet Union is it's not just Orthodox. It's it's Muslim, Buddhist, very multi-religious. But it's really in the 1920s, and really the most intense phase is the 1930s. That's just I'd even thought, gee, why has no one written a book about just, if you connect a lot of dots, the Spanish Civil War, Mexican Revolution, what's going on in post-Ottoman Turkey, Stalinist persecutions, the Stalinist stooge in Mongolia that essentially destroyed every Buddhist monastery in the entire country. It's kind of remarkable what took place under the sort of aegis of various secularisms.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these, Spain and Turkey and Mexico, in just a second. I want to ask you this too. Coming back to this, as you said, the stadial kind of philosophies, if you will, the stages, one stage succeeding the other. So you think about Comte with what you described, religion to philosophy to positivism. You think about, is it Hegel, synthesis? Thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. You think about Marx with the kind of these various stages arriving in the proletariat paradise and so on. Do you have a theory as to why these particular theories of it's progress, we are moving in this direction, we will arrive at where we need to go, were those intoxicating to people in the sense that they sort of borrowed from the notion, from a religious notion of an end of history, or millennials, or millenarianism, or and even more, the notion that we are part of this process and therefore we have some control in it, and that gives us kind of our calling and vocation. What's your sense with the intoxication with the stadial philosophical approach?
No, yeah, I think all of the above. I think you began to answer some of that. I think that there is a school of historical thought. One German figure named Karl Löwit comes to mind that sees some of these modern ideologies as building off the sort of millenarian eschatological views, and usually in very simplistic terms, when people contrasts the West to the East, it's sort of more of a linear conception of history that moves from creation to fall to redemption to final things, and in that maybe very broad sense, you could say that it taps into that. but there might even be a deeper human desire. Why is like the zodiac popular with people? Why
Yeah,
divination
yeah.
and just desire? What is my future? What is the desire to know? So I think that's one reason for the intoxication. But I think I don't really use that word, but I think to have certainly in a Christian framework, we would think of our vocation, as Christians, you have to kind of know the narrative that you're operating
Yeah.
within. This is the narrative gives your life meaning, gives it purpose, and I think for some of these radical ideologies, whether they were interpreted in anti-religious or strictly in socioeconomic or political terms, did confer a type of meaning and purpose and direction, and that should be recognized. That should be recognized as well.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Hatred of Religion. In his book Broken Altars, Tal Howard quotes an anti-clerical Aragonese commenting about the murder of priests during the Spanish Civil War. Quote, Father Domingo was a very good man, but we had to kill all the priests, close quote. So Tal, in his iconic memoir, The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn noted, quote, to do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, it is in the nature of the human being to seek a justification for his actions. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology, that is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is a social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praises and honors, close quote. So, Tal, that's just unbelievably chilling kind of definition of ideology from somebody who experienced ideology at its worst. Is eliminationist secularism, in eliminationist secularism, does ideology excuse all?
Yeah, the quote, I think I would broadly subscribe to what Solzhenitsyn is talking about there. I think even prior to modern ideologies, and here I think religious wars can be uh, called to count for this as well, but just an us them mentality. That's sadly kind of part of what it is to be human.
Yeah.
But I think, if you look, not the cases I didn't cover, certainly the Nazi case, and in the Bolshevik Revolution, but also in the Spanish Civil Wars as well, and kind of on both sides, is to feel like there is this other category of people that are uh, either inimical or they're let's see what the words I'm trying to find are, to say that they're going to be standing against what sort of needs to happen in history. And the Spanish Civil War, that was kind of a real learning process to me, to
Mm-hmm.
recognize there were thousands of priests and religious, and 13 bishops were killed at the time. And I think what ideology can do is just sort of erode what we might all feel just in our conscience. It can surpass that if believed, strongly and ardently enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I was shocked by the role that laws played that were laws that were enshrined in the constitutions, as we described the France's 1905 Constitution, Mexico's 1917 Constitution,
Yeah.
Spain's 1931 Constitution. So I was shocked by the role that laws enshrined in those constitutions of Western nations,
Yeah.
rooted deeply in their Catholic faith, would so viciously outlaw, terrorize, and crush religious belief in believers. So, Tal, in your research, have you been struck by the instance after instance of despotic law enacted by democratic means?
Um, yeah, I mean, those would be examples, and sometimes democratic or only quasi-democratic
Yeah, yeah.
means, and many of the constitutions in Eastern Europe, as I alluded to earlier in the Soviet Union, had fairly democratic elements to them. You could
Hmm.
probably detect anti-clerical elements as well, but we're not necessarily talking about just strongmen who, monarchs of old. There is sort of a whole democratic apparatus
Yeah.
that takes place in Mexico or Spain or in Turkey. Turkey too. I mean, that would be uh, a case where secularism is enshrined, and there is a pretty draconian state secularism directed against Muslims in the case of Turkey.
I want to be sure that people understand too the chapters in this book. Secular onslaught. First of all, three ways. Chapter one, secularist onslaughts. Chapter two, Soviet severities. Chapter three, Eastern Europe. Chapter four, and Red Asia. Chapter five. They are gripping chapters. And again, I almost fell off my chair when I'm reading about Mexico. When I was reading about Turkey, um, the enactments of such terrible and draconian measures to kind of crush the religious sensibilities or the religious institutions of the day. It's shocking, and again, this book does such a good job of defining terms and then giving significant examples of this, unless one thinks that, well, we're so enlightened we don't go there anymore. It's like, no, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to kind of leaping off from that point, in Eliminationist secularism, you talk about the difference between terror and violence. Um, what is the difference, and how is terror employed to affect its desired ends?
Yeah. Yeah, I believe I quote the 20th century political thinker Hannah Arendt, and making this distinction. Uh, you know, uh, Terror is kind of what happens when a government either loses or is very worried about losing its legitimacy, and resorts to essentially terrorizing the population, and when sometimes through quasi legal means, but sometimes through extrajudicial means as well. And certainly she had the totalitarian governments in mind when she was talking about that, how a whole population can be terrorized. I actually had my first trip to Europe. I actually went to Eastern Europe prior to the wall coming down, so
Oh, wow.
I spent some time in Romania, where the dictator then was Nicolae Ceausescu. So I was able to see a little bit about what this world looked like on the other side
Hmm.
of the Iron Curtain. And certainly we haven't really talked about the East, Asia as well. But
Yeah.
in some ways, that's some of the worst cases took place, and in Mongolia. And these are still ongoing issues today, just with China's policy toward Tibet, uh, China's policy toward the Uyghur Muslims, but also the non-registered, religious communities, and the Catholic community as well. I actually have a piece in the Wall Street Journal coming out about this Saturday about the repression of the house church movement in China today. So yeah, Christians as well. But actually, one of the real learnings of this research on this book was how Buddhism has taken it on the chin in the 20th century.
Mm.
If you connect the dots between, there's three enclaves of Buddhism and the Soviet Union that were repressed quite violently. and Soviet-dominated Mongolia, and then also with China, especially in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, which was just a real assault on all kinds of traditional communities. And then you could connect that to North Korea, but also to Cambodia when there was, in Pol Pot's armies, there were so-called pagoda smashing units that he really wanted to eliminate any trace of religion. That was such a rabid form of Marxist-Leninism. But anyway, you connect all those dots, and I thought, gee, wow, that's Buddhism. That story needs to be known better,
Yes.
better than it is, sadly.
So in Broken Altars, this is a little bit of a longer excerpt, but it's a good long paragraph. But I wanted to read this. You write this: in the 20th century, the actual administration of violence took many forms. The sudden abolition of longstanding religious practices, institutions, and holy days, confiscation of religious property, destruction of religious art, sacred objects, manuscripts, and architecture, requiring oaths of political allegiance, repurposing sacred sites for mundane uses, censorship, requirements to inventory sacred valuables, secret police surveillance, and the employment of civilian informants, banning or politically dominating seminaries and other institutions of religious education, coercing believers into psychiatric institutions, insistence on cumbersome forms of official registration, travel bans and restrictions, public ridicule, exhuming the dead and destroying cemeteries, denying educational opportunities and job promotions, banning public religious proclamation, promoting schisms within and between religious communities, the production of anti-religious propaganda, punitive taxation and fees, and other forms of excessive and arbitrary bureaucratic regulation, in addition to show trials, imprisonments, deportation, forced labor, re-education camps, struggle sessions, torture, and execution. I mean, you look at that and you say every arrow in the quiver of these entities that want to crush religion has been used, and that's even that's in the 20th century, and it precedes the 20th century. Tal, in your research and writing about France and Mexico and Spain and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Red Asia, and do you become, and first of all, this has got to be hard work to spend your days delving into this stuff. Do you become, and not to say I don't think you're a misanthropic sort of person. Do you become numb to the savagery, or are you repeatedly shocked by the depths of human depravity? And what have you learned about the human condition in the process of your research?
Yeah, no. It's interesting. That paragraph comes from the introduction, and often the case. Working on a book, you'll write an introduction, then you'll work on the parts of the book, and you come back and revise. That started with maybe 3 or 4 lines, but as I did more research and writing, that paragraph got to get longer and longer. I'd write a note to myself like, go back to that paragraph and add this, and now we need to add
one more bad thing. Yeah,
and we need to add this, but. I mean, in some ways, it was a very meaningful project to work on because I just feel, this is just not a story that's known that well. I mean, especially if you look at, just our news and some more elite culture, that I think this narrative is just missing, and it should be known. So I, go back to the word vocation. I had a real strong sense of vocation of making this, better known because I think there are many. Just unknown cases of history of suffering, that need to be known better. Again, not just for religious or Christian pleading, but just to get the historical record straight is what I was trying to do. And so, I think, that's, and what I wanted to do in some ways is kind of let the numbers and case studies speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So I do have, some analysis in some parts, and certainly in the introduction and the conclusion, but my goal in the chapters was just kind of to, add up, some of the details, drawing from some of the best scholarship that's been done, especially in the Soviet realities, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in 1991, there's been a lot of good scholarship, but as the case with scholarship, sometimes by just period and regional specialization, things are known by some specialists, don't get known by others. So in this project, I was trying to kind of aggregate what's actually known in a number of specializations and put it in a more coherent story and connect the dots between the different stories. But that paragraph, as you were just instances were coming into my mind, I learned this. And, another enjoyable, I mean, again, sad and sobering, but I did travel some. So I went to Lithuania, and Lithuania was of interest because during the Soviet period, that was the only Catholic majority state
Mm,
in all of the Soviet Union. So it often was, targeted especially by the KGB because they were always worried that, that had Western ties. But then, really, one of the most extreme places was Little Albania. The dictator there, Enver Hoxha, took the unprecedented step in 1967 to criminalize religion. Where one
mm,
could not be religious, and the situation was so severe there that every mosque and church in the country was either destroyed or repurposed there, but also in the Soviet Union, a number of churches and monasteries were turned into so-called museums of atheism to
mm,
portray religion in the worst possible light. In Albania, but in the 1970s, laws were passed. You couldn't even name your children after biblical or Quranic names,
my gosh.
and parents were so scared that they were afraid to catechize their children because the children might say something at school,
Mm,
so I mean, yeah, you need to recognize differences. Every place was not that severe, but I
yeah.
thought if I could, my question of going to Lithuania and Albania was like, what does the 20th century look like from these two countries? And it's a very different story than what
Yeah.
we might tell ourselves about the relationship of religion and secularity and modernity.
Tal, as a Czech communist news source complained, and you have this in your book, quote, in developed socialism, religion persists as the gravest obstacle of the ideological purification of society, close quote. So, in the midst of passive, combative, and eliminationist secularism, could you say a few words about the tenacity, the bravery, and the inspiration of those who are oppressed?
Yeah. Yeah. No. To come back to what I just said, that differences need to be recognized. Like say in Eastern Europe, in some ways, just the assault on religion in Albania sadly succeeded. It really destroyed religious literacy. It cut long-standing traditions of just historical knowledge. But in other places, it did spark backlashes. Some in the Czech Republic, certainly in Poland. I mean, the culture that John Paul II comes out of is that it really in some ways invigorates Polish Catholicism. In Lithuania too, there was one of the samizdat, this sort of forbidden literature
Mm-hmm.
that circled in the Soviet Union. But in 1972, um, the underground church there began to try to publicize things that were going on, and that was that played a really strong role in invigorating the dissident movements, and not just in Lithuania but other places as well. It inspired a similar publication or journal in Ukraine, for example. So there is a lot of tenacity and um, heroism. Sadly, the truth needs to be recognized. There's also a good bit of collaboration
Mm-hmm.
as well, and uh, you know, the sometimes states took a more frontal assault, like in Albania, but often it was a desire just to infiltrate the church, offer kind of rewards and perks to clergy who were loyal, and would toe the party line. So, that needs to be recognized too. Along with examples of bravery and heroism and defiance.
Tally, you talked a little bit about kind of the sense of vocation in this. When was there a moment that you realized I need to do this? Was there an experience in Lithuania or in Romania or reading something, or was this just an accretion of moments that came to full fruition when you reached out to, or you got reached out to about having a contract for a book? What was the pivotal moment to say, let's go forward with this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Probably an accretion at some level, and certainly traveling in Eastern Europe prior to all the changes that after 1989, I had really clear memories of what that looked like, and the fear. I was kind of always just sensitive to that. This was actually a COVID project, so I probably
Mm,
found myself with more time on my hands during COVID. We were all and in our homes, and not going out as much. And so I thought I would develop a little essay, and that's all I intended to do. And I had taken these terms, and I should give credit to the terms we've talked about, the passive, combative, and eliminationist secularism. I draw from Amit Kuru, who's a Turkish political scientist, and French theorist named Jean Babaco, and then a recently sadly deceased anthropologist of Soviet atheism, Sonia Luhrmann. And I had those three categories, and I developed just a little essay, about 17, 18 pages. But once I got to I'd written it, I thought, well, this is actually more than an essay. This is like in germ, maybe a little book could be developed. I was working on this other project, so as I jokingly say, I started moonlighting on myself, and writing this book instead. And I have a wonderful editor, Jennifer Banks. I've worked with for a couple of books at Yale University Press, and I sent it to her, and they wanted me to go forward with it as a book, and then things begin moving after that.
Tal, you've been so generous with your time. We have one last question, and that's simply this: how have you personally been changed in the process of researching and writing this book?
Yeah. I think my training as a historian is more 19th, 20th century, European intellectual history with a focus on religious matters and theology. I think this is maybe much more globally conscious. I think and more attentive to things like the plight of the Uyghurs or the underground churches in China tonight. I think it's this, and in other areas, sometimes in the West and the North Atlantic world, we have certain ideas that we think are sacrosanct or true, but having, again, maybe I'm saying just what I said a minute ago, having a broader global view, awareness of religious politics, the plight of religious communities, and in some places. But two things I would maybe just add here at the end. Let's see. One is that a sub argument of the book is that sometimes secularist policies themselves, they actually kind of engender more extremist religion, and usually. When you talk about, say, Islamic extremism, you just focus on the extremism. But, Kemalism, that's the ideology in Turkey that was, exported in various places. That, I wanted to argue, too, that extreme secularism has often precipitated a powerful counter response, and that shouldn't just be labeled extremism or fundamentalism. Sometimes it's tied back to extreme secularism. Or use the Spanish Civil War as an example. Franco was the dictator that eventually comes to power, and was in Spain, for much of the 20th century, and the extreme secularism there was just a gift to Franco, because it was just, and then he kind of took it in a different direction. I think I had a second point, but I'm afraid I forgot my second point.
Well, thank you so much again. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thomas Albert Howard, professor, author, and chronicler of the Secularist Violence in Modern History. Thank you so much again for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
It's been a pleasure being here and talking with you.
So I've been thinking. In the Gospel of Matthew, shortly after St. Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." In reading Thomas Albert Howard's book, Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History, hell seems to be giving it a go. Whether in France or Mexico, Eastern Europe or Spain, China or North Korea, modern states and their vicious ideologies have stopped at nothing to destroy the church, her children, and all that she cares about. And the catalog of measures used to do so knows no bounds. What is it about the church that is so threatening to secularist philosophies and regimes? Stepping aside from passive secularism, which seems intent on establishing certain bright lines for the efficient function of church and state, the combative and eliminationist secularism seem intent on dominating not only the state, but the soul. And the church decidedly is not about to relinquish its children's souls. In a chilling comment to workers in Milan in 1922, fascist dictator Benito Mussolini explained, "My father was a blacksmith who bent the red-hot iron on the anvil. Sometimes as a child, I helped my father in his hard, humble job. And now I have the much harsher and harder job of bending the souls." To eliminate the community worship, to censor religious books and speech, to harass disciples of faith so they know no peace, or to exile, imprison, torture, or murder them, is to create a vacuum. It is an attempt to make Augustine's restless heart remain restless, to make the God-shaped hole remain unfilled. And yet, that never happens. God finds a way in. He wafts in through the cracks along the door jambs or the gaps in the window. Alexander Solzhenitsyn asserted, "When you've robbed a man of everything, he's no longer in your power. He's free again." Or as George Orwell wrote, "You just got to say to yourself, I'm a free man in here," tapping his forehead, "and you're all right." We can be compelled to do and say a lot of things, but we can't ultimately be forced to believe something that isn't true or not believe something that is true. That's core of the soul stuff. Winston Churchill once insisted, "The truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." Thomas Albert Howard's book shows us how secularism has worked damned hard to eradicate religion in society and in the soul. It's a brutal story, but it'll never fully work. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Or, to repeat Churchill's line, in the end, there it is. And one last thing. Read Tal Howard's book, Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History, but also read George Orwell's 1984 to get a dark understanding of the sinister totalitarian aims ideologies employ to control the soul. What Orwell writes in fiction echoes what has happened in history. May we be prepared in faith and courage for the struggle that may lie ahead. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.